They say Mammoth Cave don't give back what it takes, that its tunnels stretch so deep, so far, that a man could wander forever and never see the light again. But what if I told you there was one man, who braved that darkness and claimed it as his own? A man who walked where no soul had ever walked before, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. This is the story of Stephen Bishop, the slave who became an explorer, the man who mapped the underworld and the legend that still lingers in the depths of Mammoth Cave. But the real question is, did the cave ever truly let him go? Welcome to Kentucky Time Capsule by Kentucky Melody, where we're constantly digging up the grit, the glory, and the feuds that bled into history, bringing forgotten legends and game-changing moments back to life. So light that lantern and step into the past, 'cause the echoes of yesterday are still calling. Now, reckon most folks don't pay much mind to where a man starts out, but in Stephen Bishop's case, it's mighty important. He come into this world round 1821, born into slavery somewhere in Kentucky. Now, there ain't much writ down about them early years, 'cause folks like him weren't the kind the world kept records on. But what's sure as daylight is that fate had something bigger in store for him than toil and chains. Come 1838, a man by the name of Franklin Gorin bought himself a cave, Mammoth Cave, biggest one anybody'd ever known. A place so deep and dark, folks whispered it was bottomless, a crack in the earth where the sun never dared step foot. But Gorin didn't care about all that mystery. Nah, he saw something else. Money. He aimed to make that cave a tourist spectacle, selling tours to highfalutin folks from Louisville, Cincinnati, even as far as Europe. And what did a businessman need to lead them high society folks through the dark? That's where Stephen come in. A boy, barely a man, handed off like a piece of property, his fate changed with the scratch of a pen. But where some men get swallowed up by the life forced on 'em, Stephen grew bigger than it. He didn't just learn the cave, he claimed it. The rock, the dark, the endless turns and hollows, it all became his. While others feared what lay beyond the lantern's glow, Stephen stepped into the blackness, unafraid. It weren't long before the folks coming through that cave weren't talking about Mammoth itself, they was talking about Stephen. How he could lead a man through the dark like he was walking his own backyard. How he knew the tunnels and chambers like he'd carved them himself. How he found places no man had ever laid eyes on before. Passages long as forever, pits so deep the wind never reached the bottom. He weren't just some poor boy trapped in chains no more. No, sir. He was a legend in the making. And the dark, it ain't never seen another like him since. When Stephen Bishop first laid eyes on Mammoth Cave, it weren't much more than a dark, endless mouth of mystery. Folks back then didn't know but a handful of its secrets, just a few main paths where daylight still felt close enough to touch. The rest? Well, it was a shadowy maze, twisting and turning, like the earth itself was trying to keep its treasures hid. But Stephen? He weren't the type to shy away from the dark. Nah, the dark seemed to call to him, like it knew he'd understand it better than most. With nothing but a lantern to cut the black and a rope slung over his shoulder, he set off where no man had dared tread before. The walls of the cave, cold and slick, seemed to lean in close, whispering secrets only he was brave enough to listen to. There was one place, though, that had stopped every explorer dead in their tracks, a gaping chasm so wide, so deep, they called it the bottomless pit. They said if you dropped a stone, you'd never hear it hit bottom, like the earth just swallowed it whole. Most men stood at the edge and turned back, their lantern shaking in their hands. But Stephen, he didn't stop. With a ladder cobbled together from whatever he could find, he crossed that pit. Step by careful step, the blackness below pulling at him like a hungry thing. When he reached the other side, the cave seemed to open up in ways no one ever dreamed, revealing new passages and chambers that had been waiting for someone brave enough to find them. And it weren't just the physical places he uncovered, it was the way he brought them to life. Take that narrow, twisting passage he found. Most would have cursed the tight squeezes and turned back, but Stephen, he chuckled and named it Fat Man's Misery, saying a man with a few extra pounds might just have to leave 'em behind to get through. Or the rivers he found, their waters whispering in the dark, reminding him of the old stories of the underworld. He called them the River Styx and Lake Lethe, names that gave the black waters a strange, otherworldly kind of weight. Then there was the Star Chamber, a room that seemed to hold a piece of the night sky itself. When Stephen brought his lantern low, the light danced off the minerals in the ceiling, making it look like the heavens had come underground. He'd tell visitors to snuff out their lights, letting the silence settle thick, and then he'd light his lantern just right. Folks swore it was like staring straight up at God's own sky. Stephen didn't just explore the cave, he gave it a soul. Every rock, every shadow, every hidden corner came alive in the names he gave and the stories he told. Mammoth Cave weren't just a big hole in the ground no more. It was a place full of wonder, danger, and secrets that only a man like Stephen could bring to light. And even now, deep in the quiet of the cave, it's like you can still feel his presence, bold, fearless, and always one step ahead of the darkness. It didn't take long for Stephen Bishop to become the heart and soul of Mammoth Cave. Folks came from all over, wealthy plantation owners, city folk from up north, even European travelers with money to burn. They weren't just there for the cave, they were there for him. Word spread quick that this young guide, born into bondage, could make the darkest depths of the earth feel like an adventure. And when Stephen spoke, folks listened. Now, Stephen weren't just a guide, no sir, he was a storyteller, the kind that could spin a yarn so vivid you'd swear you were living it. He didn't just lead folks through the passages, pointing out rocks and hollows, he brought the cave to life. When he talked about the glittering minerals in the star chamber or the eerie pull of the bottomless pit, he did it with a mix of smarts and mystery, making the cave feel like something alive. He'd share the science of it, too, explaining how the stalactites formed or how the underground rivers carved their way through the stone. But just when folks thought they had it all figured out, he'd lower his lantern, lean in close, and add something to set their hearts to racing.
"Now let me tell you,"
he'd say, his voice dropping to a whisper,
"there's more to this cave than rock and water. It's got its secrets, and it don't take kindly to trespassers."
One of his most famous stories, and the one that stuck in people's bones, was about the ghost of the lost explorer. He'd tell it like this.
"Now y'all stick close and mind your lanterns. This cave don't take kindly to wanderers, and it sure don't forgive no fools. I ever tell y'all about the scholar who thought he was too smart for a guide? Well, Mammoth Cave got a way of humbling folks who think they're bigger than the dark. This man came down all puffed up, dressed finer than a preacher on Sunday morning. He had himself a shiny lantern and a notebook, claiming he was here to chart the cave for science. Said he didn't need no help, 'cause he'd read all about the place. I told him, 'Sir, this cave don't care about your books. It swallows light like a hungry beast, and it don't give up what it takes. but he just laughed, real smug-like, and set off alone, his lantern throwing jittery shadows on the walls. I watched him disappear down the main passage, his boots echoing like a heartbeat in the still air. Then the echo stopped. Days later, when he didn't come back, we went looking for him. We searched every tunnel we could, calling his name till our voices cracked, but the cave just swallowed the sound. Finally, near the bottomless pit, a place so deep it feels like it pulls the breath right out of your chest, we found something. Not him, mind you, just his hat, sitting there on the edge like he'd taken it off polite before disappearing into the void. The strange thing, his lantern was still burning, but the light was dim, flickering like it was gasping for air. Now some say he fell, but others, those who've spent enough time down here, they say something else got him. See, Mammoth Cave has a way of keeping things. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of the rock above, the stillness, like the air itself is holding his breath. Folks who go too deep sometimes don't come back, at least not all of them. Late at night, when the cave's silent and the lanterns are out, that's when it starts. You'll hear it, soft footsteps just behind you. They don't echo like they ought to. They just creep slow and steady like something trying not to be noticed. And sometimes you'll hear him, whispering. Folks say it sounds like he's begging, asking for help, or maybe warning you not to go any further. But when you turn around, there ain't nothing there. Just the cold, heavy dark closing in. Now here's the part you gotta remember. If you ever hear someone calling your name from the shadows, don't answer. And if you see a dim light bobbing in the distance, don't follow it. 'Cause it ain't yours to find. It might just be him, still wandering, still searching for a way out that ain't there. Mammoth Cave don't let go of what it takes. And if you don't listen to your guide, well, you might just end up joining him. So, if you hear someone calling from the shadows, don't answer. It might just be him still looking for a way out.
By the time Stephen finished his tale, folks would be clutching their lanterns tight, looking over their shoulders, wondering if that chill in the air was just the cave or something else. Stephen's charisma and knowledge made him a legend in his own time, but it was his way with words that kept people coming back. He didn't just guide people through Mammoth Cave, he let them feel its heartbeat, its secrets, and its dangers. And in a place as vast and dark as that, sometimes a good story was the only light you had. While Stephen's name rose to prominence as the guide and master of Mammoth Cave, the harsh truth of his life as an enslaved man hung over him like the weight of the rock above. No matter how far he explored or how much he discovered, his freedom was always bound by another man's will. In 1839, when Dr. John Croghan, a wealthy physician, purchased Mammoth Cave, Stephen's fate shifted once more. Croghan wasn't content with the cave just being a tourist attraction. No, he had bigger ideas. He believed the cave, with its cool, steady air, held the power to heal tuberculosis, the deadly disease taking lives across the country. So, he set about turning the cave into what he called the sanatorium, a place where the sick might find salvation underground. But what Stephen saw unfold in those days was far from salvation. The patients, pale, hollow-eyed souls, some barely holding on to life, were brought down into the cave and set up in small wooden huts scattered in the darkness. The only light came from lanterns and the flicker of hope in their faces, hope that the cave might save them. But Stephen, with his deep knowledge of the cave and its ways, likely knew better. The atmosphere in that underground sanatorium was eerie. The air was cool, but it carried the sound of wet, hacking coughs that echoed off the walls, following Stephen wherever he went. The lantern light cast long, ghostly shadows across the huts, making the place feel more like a tomb than a haven. Visitors who came to tour the cave whispered about the patients they saw, their bodies thin as reeds, moving like specters through the tunnels. Stephen guided people through it all, his lantern leading the way past scenes of hope turning to despair. As the days stretched on, the patients didn't get better. The damp, dark air didn't heal them. It only seemed to sap what little strength they had left. One by one, they succumbed to the disease, their faint breaths disappearing into the silence of the cave. Stephen, always the steady hand, likely helped carry some of the bodies back to the surface, their pale faces etched into his memory. When the experiment failed, Krogan had no choice but to abandon it, leaving behind the echo of what might have been. The wooden huts were left to rot, swallowed by the cave's endless dark, a reminder of how human ambition and desperation can falter in the face of nature's power. For Stephen, those days must have been heavy. He'd seen the cave's beauty, its wonders, and its secrets, but he'd also seen its darker truths. Mammoth Cave wasn't just a place of exploration. It was a place that held life and death in equal measure, where the light of hope could be snuffed out by the cold, silent dark. And yet, through it all, Stephen kept moving, his lantern cutting through the shadow, leading others through the same darkness that had claimed so many before them. For near 2 decades, Stephen Bishop walked where no man had walked before, claiming the darkness as his own, leading folks through the belly of the earth with nothing but a lantern and his wits. He had spent half his life breathing the still, heavy air of Mammoth Cave, his footsteps etching paths into the stone. And then, in 1856, he was granted the one thing no man should have to be granted, his freedom. But fate, it seems, had a cruel way of settling debts. He weren't a free man long, just a year. In 1857, at only 37 years old, death came knocking at his door. Folks never did settle on what took him. Some say it was tuberculosis, the same sickness that had claimed those poor souls in the cave sanatorium, maybe something he breathed in all them years carrying out the dead. Others reckon it was the weight of his own exploring, the grueling work of crawling through tight tunnels, hauling heavy loads, leading folks long past the time most men would have dropped from exhaustion. Maybe it was the cave itself, taking back the man who had dared to tame it. One thing's sure, he didn't die as no ordinary man. He died a legend. They buried him near the entrance of the cave in the old guide cemetery, where the trees keep watch and the wind hums low through the branches. His headstone stands there to this day, the words carved deep as the passages he once ruled. Stephen Bishop, first guide and explorer of the cave. A simple mark for a man who left footprints where no light had ever shone before. Stephen Bishop wasn't just a guide. He was a trailblazer, a man who turned the unknown into something folks could marvel at. His contributions to Mammoth Cave are so deep-rooted they're like the stone itself, immovable and everlasting. It was Stephen who took that wild, yawning labyrinth and gave it shape and sense. He crafted one of the first accurate maps of the cave, a feat so precise it was used long after he was gone. Imagine that, an enslaved man, without any formal schooling, creating a map that rivaled the work of the world's finest surveyors. He didn't just chart the land, he claimed it with the names he gave. Names that still echo in the halls of Mammoth Cave today. The Bottomless Pit, Fat Man's Misery, the River Styx. They weren't just places. They were stories stories Stephen breathed into the rock with his words. But it wasn't just his discoveries that left a mark. It was the man himself. Franklin Gorin would later speak of Stephen Bishop with an admiration rarely given to an enslaved man in those days. He described him as a man of sharp intellect and natural brilliance, someone who had educated himself despite every obstacle. Stephen had a mind that soaked up knowledge like the cave walls held on to secrets, effortlessly, instinctively. He could speak on geology with learned men, recognizing the bones of the earth as if he'd been born from its depths. He even dabbled in Latin and Greek, picking up words from the travelers who passed through, letting their languages roll off his tongue like he'd known them all his life. But what set Stephen apart more than anything was his understanding of people. He had a way of sizing up a man or woman before they even spoke a word, reading them like an open book. He could match wits with a scholar, charm a lady, or cut up like a fool if it meant lightening the mood in the depths of the cave. He was as trusted as he was brilliant, as quick-witted as he was knowledgeable. Those who came to Mammoth Cave expecting to be amazed by its wonders left talking about Stephen instead, his wit, his humor, his unshakable courage. Even professors of geology marveled at how much he knew, speaking of him like he was a scholar himself, though he had never once sat in a classroom. His genius wasn't born from books alone. It was born from experience, curiosity, and an instinct to understand the world around him. And yet, through all his accomplishments, Stephen's life wasn't his own. The chains of slavery bound him, even as he charted a world no man had dared to enter before. But somehow, even in that darkness, he became a light. He took what little freedom the world allowed him and turned it into something magnificent. Today, Stephen Bishop's name is carved into the history of Mammoth Cave, just as surely as his footsteps are worn into its stone. His life is a testament to the brilliance and resilience of a man who refused to let the world's shadows define him. Instead, he illuminated them, becoming a beacon for all who followed. When you stand at the entrance to Mammoth Cave, listen close. The echoes you hear, they ain't just the whispers of stone, they're the voice of Stephen Bishop, still guiding folks through the dark, still telling the stories that'll never fade. Well now, have you ever visited Mammoth Cave and heard the stories of Stephen Bishop? Do you believe Mammoth Cave is haunted by those who never found their way out? If you could explore one uncharted place, where would it be? What do you think was Stephen Bishop's greatest achievement? His mapping of the cave, his storytelling, or his ability to inspire? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep Kentucky's history alive. If you've been captivated by Stephen's journey, there's plenty more where that came from. Kentucky is filled with stories of resilience, mystery, and forgotten legends just waiting to be unearthed. Join us in the Kentucky Time Capsule podcast playlist here on the Kentucky Melody YouTube channel, where we bring the past back to life, one story at a time. Hit subscribe, step into the darkness with us, and let's explore the legends that still linger in the shadows. Because history ain't just something you read, it's something you feel. And if you listen close enough, you just might hear the echoes of those who came before us.